So the intuitive mindset I would describe as something where you can kind of arrive at the answer still using theory and still using probability, combinatorics, and anything that you feel like using, like blockers, any of that. But you don't have to go via this ideal of what is correct given to you by solvers, given to you by game theory. So the way that I would think about a hand is that I would be on the river and I would be like, okay, I think he'll probably fold 80% of his range if I bet this size. Instead of thinking, I think he's overfolding, so I'm going to use these hands as well as these hands to, you see what I mean? So do you agree with that distinction?
So, I mean, you can only exploit if you know where the equilibrium lies. And you can do intuitive things that are good without knowing the equilibrium. And if you're a smart player, you might do better than somebody who's never played before, right? I mean, to a certain extent, everybody who hasn't studied game theory models is just playing intuitively, right? Because those are the only two options, right? I mean, you can either have studied the game or you can have not studied it and think about it.
Yeah, so this is where the kind of semantics and words really kind of get a bit messy. But words just don't have like accurate enough definitions, because I would actually argue that even the game theory players are playing intuitively as well. I also agree that the other people are playing intuitively too. But I don't think, even if people think they're GTO robots that are sitting there and like, I only make mathematical decisions, I don't think that that's actually the case. And I think that the decisions they're making come from their autopiloting that has stemmed from millions and millions of hands they've played and getting a feel for the game, because you just don't have enough time to be able to work out every single individual mathematical nuance when you're in a hand. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with that. But for the sake of argument, I guess what I'm trying to get at is let's say there's two groups of players. Mm-hmm. There's one group of players who starts by saying, okay, the equilibrium is whatever, something. And then I think my opponent is doing something, and that might be the equilibrium, or it might be, something different. And because of that, I'm going to try and, do certain things to exploit them. Yeah. That's group one. Group two doesn't know the equilibrium and is thinking about certain things, like, as you mentioned, blockers, maybe live tells, maybe just the player's profile, right? I mean, when I started playing, people always said, the Russians are crazy, like call down the Russians and don't call down the Canadians or whatever, you know what I mean? But like, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So some combination of smart things that you can think about, but without knowing the equilibrium.
Yeah.
And that's fine. I mean, you can, that's essentially what distinguishes a first-time player from a 50th time player, right? If you take two recreational players, one who's never played before and one who's on his 50th session, the guy on his 50th session is going to play much better because he's, realized, hey, like, maybe I shouldn't, bet on that ace, or maybe I should bet on that ace or whatever, because he has some pattern recognition because he's played some spots. Okay. So you can, and then of course, somebody who has played a lot of hands can do more sophisticated things than just the simple, oh, the ace is good, the ace is bad that I was describing. You can, use blockers and whatever. But if you don't know what the equilibrium is, you cannot exploit.
So I guess I would just have to, we're just going to have to agree on a term, because otherwise we're going to go around in circles about what exploit means. If you want to use that definition of exploit, then I'm super happy to use that for the rest of the conversation. But exploiting can technically mean like anything of taking advantage of someone else's weaknesses. So when you first started playing, you could still have another player who's like open shoving every hand. You would be exploiting that by calling off with ace 10 off,
Right. So
this weakness. But I'm happy if, for the rest of the conversation, if you'd like to only describe exploit as something deviating from optimal that's already preconceived in your head.
Okay, so I guess the one thing I would say is if people are playing outlandishly far from the equilibrium, you can exploit them without knowing the equilibrium yourself, simply by realizing that can't be the equilibrium. Right? If I tell you that my strategy is to go all in for 100 big blinds with aces and fold everything else, then you would simply, min raise everything. And when I went all in, you would call me when you also had aces and
take notes, guys.
And that's not like, that would be you exploiting me, right? And you could do that pretty easily without knowing what the actual equilibrium was at whatever game we were playing. But that ceases to be useful when people play, a reasonable approximation to the equilibrium, because you can no longer just look at that, like look at how people play and say, oh, that's like clearly far off from the equilibrium, because some equilibriums are pretty fucking weird.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I think this is something where we're definitely going to disagree on. But is it okay? So that conversation would kind of be umbrellaed as, can the first type of players that we described, the intuitive players, can they succeed nowadays in the high stakes scene? I think we're going to have disagreements on that, but if that's okay, could we leave that until we speak about the first topic that I think we're also going to disagree on?
If you're enjoying the way that I'm speaking about poker, teaching poker, I do have a website, charliecarrel.com. Link is in the description below. You'll find on there a mindset masterclass, which I think is the most important, teaching you how to deal with tilt, anxieties, ambition, things like that. You'll find a poker masterclass completely teaching you how to restructure the way that you think about poker. And you'll find a complete archive of the bankroll challenge.